Okay, folks, we're going to be working on our Unit 14 test review for U.S. history, the era of protest and change. So we're going to work on an action-reaction. Lots of this is some Cold War review. That'll be okay. And then we also have our Unit 14 limericks to work through. But we're going to start with a smartboard review in which we have events from the Civil Rights Movement. And your job is to put these in chronological order. So you can go ahead and push pause and then come back when you're ready to put them in order, or you have them in order. Okay, so let's move on to the answers. First up, we have the decision by Harry Truman, 1948, to desegregate the troops. It's a big move because people realize that the executive office is now starting to support the civil rights movement. Same thing when the second branch, the Supreme Court, affirms civil rights through the Brown versus Board decision, overturning Plessy. The Greensboro sit-ins, a good example of the initial strategy of many of these civil rights activists. Things like Montgomery bus boycott, all the civil disobedience. Pretty shortly thereafter, Martin Luther King makes the intentional decision to go to one of the most segregated cities in the South, in Birmingham, Alabama, where he is arrested for civil disobedience, which is when he writes his letter from a Birmingham jail. Remember, that's John F. Kennedy called to kind of step in and make sure he was taken care of. Shortly thereafter, he gives his I Have a Dream speech in Washington, the powerful speech that helps to solidify the movement as a national movement. Bloody Sunday, when Martin Luther King and his followers went to Selma, Alabama, and were met with a violent reaction. Pretty shortly thereafter, he is assassinated, which of course puts a huge dent in the civil disobedience part of the civil rights movement, which is followed shortly thereafter by the Watts riots, which is an example of the frustration that's spilling out because rights aren't coming perhaps quick enough. Okay, so next up, you've got a series of events and people, and your job is to figure out whether you think they belong to the 50s, the 60s, or the 70s. So you kind of have to identify what it is first, and then see where it fits second. So again, push pause, work on connecting these in your mind. You can maybe make a list on a piece of paper, and then we'll work on the answers. Okay, moving on to the answers. So in the 1950s, we knew that it was an economic boom, which led to a rise of consumerism as people began to spend on a variety of things, including service things like fast food and entertainment for their children, their baby boom children. This led to the introduction of credit cards. Plastic is a viable option after World War II. We Like Ike represents not only the popularity of this war hero, but the conformity of the era. Harry Truman was one of the main presidents during this time period, Korean War, and then we talk about women going back to the home after working in factories and with armed forces in World War II. 1960, the war in court, considered the most liberal court in American Supreme Court history. Lots of changes, including Engel versus Vital, which took school prayer out of schools, but also talked a lot about the rights of the criminals. Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda rights, Matt versus Ohio. Counterculture, the generation gap, the grooviest generation, hippies, all the protest movements, taking people away from the conformity of the 50s. Silent Spring was the book by Rachel Carson, which reminds you that the environmental movement is going to begin in earnest, as we're starting to realize that a lot of the production increases in the 1950s are creating terrible pollution, etc. LBJ was president during much of the 60s, did a lot trying to make good things happen, but Vietnam kind of kicked it off track. And the National Endowment for the Arts was one of LBJ's great society programs. In the 70s, the Environmental Protection Agency was started to help combat a lot of these, the negatives of the pollution, things like Love Canal, etc. Jimmy Carter was one of our presidents, elected because as an outsider, he was the opposite of the Watergate career politicians, although he struggled as a president. Wounded Knee too, the American Indian movement, rallied trying to kind of reverse some of the assimilation, kind of restate the Native American identity, and their protest was met with violence, just like the first time. The OPEC, oil and petroleum exporting countries, oil embargo, as Saudi Arabia, etc., cut off the spigot to the United States. We were out of gas, and that caused us to, put up national speed limits, change the types of car we drive. That's when the Volkswagen Bug came around, and crippled Carter's presidency. Disco, what else can we say? Win was Gerald Ford's economic plan to defeat stagflation. With his whip inflation now, it failed, and which is why we talk about people leaving the Rust Belt, the Northeast, places like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, to move to the Sun Belt for more of these jobs. Okay, so the third idea here is you've got a set of matching. So a famous person, and then what makes them, kind of well known. So again, you could pause here, try and figure out the answers, and then come back. Okay, so we're going to move forward here. So Betty Friedan is known as the feminist pioneer, rejected the conformity of the 50s, wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique, talked about how the women were looking for more than just being at home, so to speak. Cesar Chavez was the Latino immigrant worker supporter, similar to what Martin Luther King was able to do with black rights, he did with brown power, Chicanos. Gerald Ford, unelected president, who kind of bumbled his way through that economic downturn, did not win re-election. LBJ became president after Kennedy's assassination, the loss of Camelot. He had his Great Society program, but most of the money went to Vietnam, so it failed. JFK was a huge civil rights advocate, was pushing for civil rights slowly, but was assassinated before the Civil Rights Act of '64 could be passed. Malcolm X was kind of the foil to Martin Luther King, similar to Booker T and Webb Du Bois, wanted much faster, more radical change, was assassinated. Ike Eisenhower opened Little Rock High School to segregation. He was the one who sent in the 101st Airborne. Earl Warren was our liberal SCOTUS justice. Thurgood Marshall was the African-American lawyer who argued Brown versus Board before the Supreme Court, and he will eventually become the first African-American nominated to the Supreme Court. And Elvis Presley, good example of the conformity of the 50s, and then slowly the change out as rock and roll becomes more teenage-driven, more rebellion-driven. Okay, so let's jump over to our action-reaction. I'll give you the answers here so that you can go back through and check through them. We'll talk about them a little bit. I'm just going to read through and tell you first. You should have this sheet in your yellow folder. So you should go G, B, double A, Q, W, J, double B, F. So some keynotes in here. Because the Supreme Court did the Brown versus Board ruling in number 11, the government ordered desegregation of public schools, overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, and that's where we're going to have our little Lot 9 attempt to desegregate. Continued discrimination in the South, however, is going to lead to J, the Civil Rights Act of '64, which wasn't the first Civil Rights Act, but it was one of the stronger ones, passed after a long what's that term when you talk too long in the Senate? Filibuster. And then the Voting Rights Act of 65. Number 14, the disagreement with the nonviolent strategy and his assassination, double B, led to the popularity of some other leaders like Malcolm X and the Black Panthers. And Betty Friedan's feminine mystique was the beginning of the modern feminist movement. All right, moving on, number 16. T, E, I, A, K, double E, double C. Again, a lot of this is your Cold War stuff, but we can talk about number 17. Rachel Carson publishes Silent Spring, which leads to the beginning of the modern environmental movement, which will lead to the Clean Air and the Clean Water Act. The birthplace of the hippies, letter 18, leads to the creation of the counterculture movement. All right, finally, 23 on down. B, X, double D, M, R, V, Z, C, and Y. Looking at number 28, Nixon's Southern strategy supported gradual integration. Many Southern Democrats began to shift their votes to the Republican Party as he kind of found a way to get white votes in the South. Then number 30, OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the U.S., which helped create that stagflation and the Watergate scandal. Nixon resigned the presidency and pardoned by Ford. Okay, so last up, let's look at our limericks. Top left. All right, here we go. So you should have had a chance to kind of go through these. I'll just give you the answers. Started with Nixon scandal and cover-up of Watergate. He resigned, and Ford's pardon made us even more irate. Love Canal was unloving. Stagflation did not win. Get it? With inflation now. And OPEC took away our fuel. Amnesty for Vietnam, hostages in Iran, the birth of abortion, and brown power made Chavez cool or rule. The birth of abortion, yeah. The 70s were a drag, although in a disco queen you might fixate. All right, so that's obviously the 70s. So next one down, we're going to work through the 50s. As the world was rebuilding, our economy and our babies had a boom. Moving to the Sun Belt and suburbia with a GI Bill to have more room. Truman fought Korea, and we chanted, "We like Ike." The golden age of TV and rock and roll music took the mic. Conformity was the norm. Under God, we would assume. Okay, third down is dealing with civil rights. Brown versus Board ended segregation, but Faubus and Wallace did not obey. Those are those two Southern governors who refused to integrate. Real change was when MLK used nonviolence and boycotts to win the day. Rosa took her seat, and the sit-ins took care of lunch, though a church bombing, Bloody Sunday, and 2 assassinations hurt a bunch. The Civil Rights Act and the Freedom Summer allowed blacks to get their way. All right, well, let's slide down a little bit and do our last, hold on here, the final limerick. Okay, talking about the 1960s. Started out with Kennedy, young and full of new frontier hope. With his death, Camelot was gone, leaving LBJ and the Great Society to cope. A counterculture awoke, baby boomers and their generation gap, LSD, free love, and the protest of Vietnam became a groovy trap. A liberal SCOTUS, feminism, and deficit spending equaled a slippery slope. Okay, so the good opportunity for you to work through those limericks. And we've got to practice DBQ here, which I'll let you work through. And then we will be taking our test soon.